Gosh, it's so good to have Amelia back in the office. It's nice to just be getting back into a rhythm and a routine. And my mind actually feels sharp. I feel, being off coffee for a little bit, I used to justify coffee as a way to sharpen my thinking. But what I'm learning is that my thinking is not so scattered when I'm not drinking coffee and consuming those large amounts of caffeine. Anyways, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about in this episode 341, Buy Low, Sell High, before we get into that, is this: there's been some volatility that has started to return in the last several weeks. And I live in an area where we live right on the Puget Sound. It's a beautiful place to live. We have this really amazing naval community. And so I wanted to find a couple of quotes around rough seas. So I've got a couple of quotes here for you that I'd like to share. The first one is, "The good seaman weathers the storm he cannot avoid, and avoids the storm he cannot weather." The next one, this quote is from Seneca. He says, "If one does not know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favorable." I thought that was really appropriate given the topic of retirement planning that we like to discuss here on the show. And the last one, last quote about volatility or rough seas is, "The pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, the realist adjusts the sails." So that's what we're going to be talking about, adjusting the sails. That is what rebalancing is. The reason that this episode came to be is because I had a listener reach out to us. And by the way, remember at Sound Retirement Planning, there's a big orange button over on the right-hand side. If you want to leave me a voicemail, that's an easy way to do it, an easy way to get in touch with me if there's a topic that you'd like me to cover. But this particular listener reached out and he said, "Jason, I've read that rebalancing helps you to buy low and sell high, but is there any research that points to how often you should rebalance?" So in today's show, I want to explore rebalancing. Specifically, what is rebalancing? Who should rebalance? When should you rebalance? Consider the tax implications and why it's important. So in the show notes, I'll provide links to all of the resources that I'm going to be mentioning in this particular episode. So if you want to dive in and explore this topic in greater detail, you can have one place you can go. Just go to Sound Retirement Planning, episode 341, click on the link and you'll see all of the show notes there. Before we explore rebalancing and why it's important to understand the importance of asset allocation, for a deep dive on asset allocation, let me encourage you to go back and listen to episode 316 titled Why Asset Allocation is So Important. But I'm currently reading a book that led me to a research paper that was published by JP Morgan Asset Management regarding the returns for the Russell 3000 index over a long period of time. The paper was published in 2014. But it was looking at the risks and rewards of concentrated stock positions compared with the performance of the overall Russell 3000 index from the year 1980 through 2014. And if you don't know, the Russell 3000 index measures the performance of the largest 3,000 U.S. companies, representing approximately 98% of the investable U.S. equity market. It's reconstituted annually to ensure that new and growing companies are reflected. The researchers analyzed all the stocks that were part of the Russell 3000 index from 1980 to 2014, which included a database of 13,000 large, mid, and small cap stocks. And there were a few really important takeaways that are summarized in the executive summary. And it's so relevant, so important that I'm just going to read this to you. Over the long run, some companies substantially outperform the broad market and maintain their value. However, the odds have been stacked against their average concentrated holder. The first bullet point says, risk of permanent impairment. Using a universe of Russell 3000 companies since 1980, roughly 40% of all stocks have suffered a permanent 70% decline from their peak value. A 70% decline from their peak value. 40% of stocks experience that. The second bullet point says negative lifetime returns versus the broad market. The return on the median stock since its inception versus an investment in the Russell 3000 index was negative 54%. 2/3 of all stocks underperformed the Russell 3000 index. And for 40% of all stocks, their absolute returns were negative. In this paper, it states that kind of another sobering statistic, this one about the S&P 500, but since 1980, over 320 companies were deleted from the S&P 500 for business distress reasons. You know, we think that it's almost un-American for a company to go out of business, but the reality is that companies go out of business all the time. Even the big companies, the strong companies, the companies that are big enough to make it into an index like the Russell 3000 or the S&P 500 index. Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, is quoted as saying, "Don't look for the needle in the haystack, just buy the haystack." When you consider that this study reveals that 40% of companies suffered a permanent decline of 70%, and 2/3 of companies do not perform as well as the index, and only 7% of the companies outperformed the index averages, well, I hope that this information that I'm sharing with you, that this report, and you can go back, you can read this report, just go to Sound Retirement Planning and click on the link. But I hope this report encourages you to consider that stock picking creates concentrated risks that are very hard to justify given the benefits of diversification. Using broad diversification can help you earn returns needed without concentrated risks so that you can enjoy an index fund rather than trying to pick the next winning stock. Trying to be the next Warren Buffett with stock picking may be fun when you're in the accumulation phase of accumulating wealth and you don't need to depend on the resources. But if you're getting ready to transition into retirement, consider using low-cost index funds to create broad diversification across asset classes, sectors, and to be diversified across the entire globe. Before we talk about rebalancing, we need to talk about portfolio construction. Portfolio construction means that you're going to need to make some decisions about how you're going to allocate your investments across several different dimensions. How much will you have in domestic stock versus international? Will you include emerging markets? How will you allocate between value and growth? Will you overweight technology or consumer staples? Or how about companies that pay dividends versus companies that don't? Will you overweight to small cap or large cap? What type of fixed income will you include? Government, tax-free, tips, corporates, high yield? How about duration of those bond holdings? What will you be comfortable with? Will you include fixed income alternatives such as certificates of deposit or fixed annuities or savings accounts? How will you diversify across taxable, tax-deferred, and tax-free positions? You can use index funds to make the asset allocation decisions, but at some point the rubber's going to hit the road and you actually have to make a decision about how you're going to construct the portfolio. Just like taking concentrated stock positions is hard to justify, it's also hard to justify taking concentrated asset allocation decisions when you can easily enjoy broad global diversification. Often people look at the historical performance of an asset class to try to understand the risks associated with the asset allocation mix, and then construct an investment portfolio that will have the qualities, characteristics, risk profile, and performance that it needs to make sure that you're going to be okay in retirement. As kind of a side note here, I heard a story about a woman who approached Pablo Picasso in a restaurant and asked him to scribble something on a napkin. And she said she'd be happy to pay whatever he felt it was worth. Picasso complied and then said, "That will be $10,000. "But you did that in 30 seconds, the woman replied. "No," Picasso said, "it has taken me 40 years to do that." Now, the reason I share that story is because, as you know, I fully support the do-it-yourself community. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I do the podcast, and it's one of the reasons that I invented the retirement budget calculator. But at the same time, I often see people trying to do something on their own that they have not spent adequate time studying. Investing may seem easy, especially in years when the market's going straight up. But once you retire, you only get one shot at getting this right. You really can't afford to be making investing mistakes at this phase of life.